Welcome to Facts on the Ground, everybody. I'm Jesse Zerwell, and I'm here with my co host, Misty Winston. And joining us today from Monaco is Alex Krainer, here to discuss the ongoing saga, the decades long saga at this point, of Theranos or Theranos, depending on your preference. Alex, thank you very much for joining us.
My privilege. Thank you for having me.
What is the correct pronunciation? Because we've heard it both ways. Is it Theranos or Theranos?
Theranos, I think, but I could be wrong.
I was saying it Theranos for the longest time, and then I watched the documentary and they were saying Theranos, and I was like, oh, okay, I've been wrong this whole time. So
okay, well, let's call it Theranos. I mean,
yeah, that's what I've been going with.
Yeah, I don't think it matters really. I think people will get the gist. It's close enough.
A fraud is a fraud. It doesn't matter what you call it.
Right.
Indeed.
So just to start, can you give our viewers and listeners a brief background of yourself and also Theranos and how you became interested in investigating and writing about them?
Okay, yeah. So I'm a former hedge fund manager. I'm not a journalist. I'm not a historian. So that's just one thing to clear out, because that kind of makes a difference in the way I approach this story. Basically, I became interested in Theranos because at the time when Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos became this rising star in the media in, I think, 2014, 2015, I was looking at it purely from the business investment point of view. So, we just kind of sat in this hedge fund office where the bulk of your job is research. So you're always scanning the news, and when a big story like that happens, you kind of can't not see it. And so I was kind of intrigued, even though my thing is trading commodity futures. So I'm not a stock investor, but this was like one of those stories that kind of an overlap between a business, a startup, and a celebrity, because they started pumping up Elizabeth Holmes as a celebrity. And so I thought, like, wow, how very interesting, this very young woman who invented some amazing technology, and she was the first self-made, or the youngest self-made female billionaire, whatever they billed her as at the time, something like that. And so I thought, how interesting. And I have to say that I kind of disbelieve things from the get-go. I for a very, very long time, my take on when the mainstream media starts going heavy on something or someone, my first instinct is to be skeptical. So I was instantly skeptical, because there's a bit too much of this, like, oh, Elizabeth Holmes. You couldn't get away from her face everywhere, like in magazines, on panels, in conferences, on Bloomberg TV, CNBC, everywhere. She was just everywhere. And so at first I was intrigued by her technology. What is this thing that she invented? And I didn't understand what it was, but I was suspicious, because it seemed to me like a very highly technological answer to a problem that wasn't, in my mind at least, wasn't a very high priority problem. We had blood testing technologies, so making them very fast, making them very cheap. Okay, fair enough. Maybe that's interesting. But then when I looked at the company's board of directors, then I knew 100% that there was something different behind this story. So she had a board of directors on a company that made no profits, on a company whose technology was largely unproven. It was very difficult to find out exactly how this thing worked. She had people like Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Mad Dog Mattis, Gary Roughhead, the former Senator Sam Nunn. These were all practically deep state players, very, very, very powerful, some of the most powerful people in the world. None of them had any expertise in medicine, in blood testing, in public health, in healthcare of any sort. So I thought, like, well, there's something else going on. I can't tell what it is, but I kind of made in my head, I kind of speculated that maybe they want to use this technology to drive diagnosing in some kind of a direction that would be favorable to the big pharma, where they could tell you, oh, guess what? You have this ailment, and so now you have to take these treatments from Pfizer, from Merck, from whoever we say. And so that's how I read it, kind of. And just in case your listeners aren't exactly too sure, so what Elizabeth Holmes claimed to have invented was a miniature blood analyzer that would be able to perform more than 200 different blood tests out of a small droplet of blood very quickly and very cheaply. And traditional blood testing technologies would use several of those largish vials, and it would take much longer, and they were much more expensive, and each kind of test maybe needed a different kind of process. So her thing would just, from a tiny little drop of blood, give you like a very thorough diagnosis across 200 different tests. So that was the idea. The problem was that not only could she not prove to anybody that this actually worked, but people who are experts in this field of blood testing and diagnosing, they pretty much said that what she's claiming is absolutely theoretically an impossibility. So it was discernible from the very start that this technology was basically a fantasy. Basically, it didn't work. And my problem with this is because, like having had 15 years in the hedge fund industry, I know that like when you want to have somebody important on your board of directors, when you want to have somebody prominent as your investor because you want to say that, oh, look, so-and-so invested in my company, these people generally don't just jump into any kind of an offer that you make them. You can't go to Henry Kissinger and say, like, hey, I'll give you $1 million a year, come on the board of directors of my company, because he's not going to damage his reputation that he's built his whole life for some scam or some, like some unicorn nonsense company. So generally, first you'll have a difficult time even getting to these people, right? You're going to have to jump through hoops, go through many gatekeepers before you're even going to get 1 minute's FaceTime with such a person. And then normally they would be connected with many experts. So they would first ask, like, hey, could you look into this and let me know what you think? I'm offered a board of directors position. Should I consider it? And then, like if you go to somebody who knows something about blood testing, they would immediately tell you, stay away from this. This is a scam of some sort. So the fact that she had all these very, very powerful players on her board of directors was an instant red flag for me that this project was something else. It was not a typical Silicon Valley startup to, turn it into a I don't know, Apple, Google, Amazon, whatever. This was some kind of a thing. And then I only connected the dots once we went into the pandemic, and I realized that Theranos was intended as an information weapon where the way this worked basically is you would have these miniature analyzers everywhere. So the intent was to have them within 5 miles of every household, through Safeway, through Walgreens, and so forth, where people would get a prick. They would have their blood sample put into Theranos machine. The data would be processed through central servers in the Silicon Valley, right? And the results would be communicated back to the testing site, and then you would get your results back. Well, this would, if the data processing was centralized, then they could just contrive an outbreak of some contagious infectious disease anywhere by their say so. They could say like, okay, let's have a, let's have an outbreak in Sweden. Let's have an outbreak in Moscow. Let's have an outbreak now in Portugal. And then, like when people go get their test done, they will say like, oops, positive, positive, positive. And then, like you get the news cycle, tens of millions of positive cases, and then this whole thing starts, and then they tell you have to get vaccinated, you have to stay locked in your home, and so forth. So that's how I interpret what Theranos was actually all about.
Well, not so much about what I appreciate about your work, because so much of the coverage around Theranos and Elizabeth Holmes is very Holmes focused. The enigma of Elizabeth Holmes, like everybody wants to get into her psyche, and they don't examine the connections behind everything that happened, because this is somebody who, obviously was raised in a wealthy family, who had connections already, but then her ability to be able to, like you said, get to these people, like high level people, the Kissingers and the Mattis and Dianne Feinstein and all of these people, that's, to me, that's the real story, is the connections and the power that's driving the whole shebang. And there isn't a lot of coverage about that. Even in the documentaries that I've watched, it's all very focused on Elizabeth Holmes, the person, and what's driving her, and she's so fascinating, this young entrepreneur, and then she ends up being a total fraud. And it's really that's why I appreciate your work, is because you really do dig kind of deeper behind the scenes and kind of get to the root of what's going on behind the company. So, it is kind of fascinating to see her, the way that she was, and I think is also very interesting is that the people who sat on these boards had no medical expertise. They were heads of state, and they were, secretaries of state, and, secretary of treasuries, and all these kinds of things, had no expertise in the medical field at all, which should have been a huge red flag to everybody. But she was able to manipulate and fool people for a very long time. It's kind of interesting.
Well, that's where I diverge from the mainstream interpretation. And it's not that nobody has covered it. It's like there's literally, from what I have seen, there's a blackout on that aspect. Like you just can't shine the light on this story from that angle. Just like, no, I haven't seen anybody do it. But like it's inconceivable that like a young 20-something bimbo, and I'm sorry to use that word, but she really was not, how would you politely say, she was an unsavory character. She was a
charlatan.
You're being polite, you're being too kind. She was
cultivated
like
charlatan.
Yeah,
she was like a toxic personality. I think that she was cultivated because she had no problem lying to her clients, to the patients, to people whose life depended on those blood tests, to investors. She lied to everybody, probably including herself.
yeah.
She had no problem going to her objectives over people's corpses. And I think that this is what made her the ideal front woman. And I think that she was simply recruited and cultivated to be the front woman for that enterprise. Her qualifications, in addition to being a pathological liar and an all-out toxic personality who could, who didn't have problem pitting people against people and playing these really devious high school politics between the departments and individuals in her company, is that allegedly she spoke fluent Mandarin, but I doubt that. Even maybe she took a few lessons and knew a little bit. Maybe she could say, "Where's the library?" in Chinese. I doubt that she was fluent, but that's how they presented her. It's inconceivable that she could maintain such a blatant deception over these very, very experienced people. Like Henry Kissinger has sat across the table with statesmen, with terrorists, with bankers, with all kinds of people negotiating treaties, negotiating contracts, trades, finance. He had Kissinger associates. I mean, that man should see a fraud from 6 light years away.
Right. He was able to almost single-handedly delay the end of the Vietnam War.
And she had him completely fooled. Not only did they were they willing to sit on the board, but they fawned over her in the press. They spoke so highly of her, of how it was almost as if she was on this pedestal for them. It was almost godlike for them. And which was really interesting to me, because you're right. People like Henry Kissinger, Mad Dog Mattis, these are people who, for better or for worse, have sat in front of a lot of different types of people, businessmen, entrepreneurs, statesmen, all kinds of stuff. And their inability to see through her fraud is kind of amazing.
No, they knew about the fraud because the fraud was theirs. They just put her on the front to front the company. It was their fraud. But the interesting thing, like how to explain that people who are that, let's call them sophisticated and experienced, and like they could pick up the phone and get anybody to give them advice, right? How could they pursue such a harebrained scheme for so long? I think that the answer is that first it was the scheme was contrived in the empire, because the whole sense, if you can get the whole world to on the same agenda, the same technology, because like if you test for something in country A using this, but country B opt for a different technology, then you can only deceive the people who are only exclusively using your own technology, and you can only achieve that if you set the rules for everybody. And then the second thing is that I think that they had this they've convinced themselves that the technology would be able to catch up with the vision. So they envisioned this, like, we would need this thing. It would have to be something like this. And then we can, like, push people around like, like those shepherd dogs that like push the whole herd where they want them with these information weapons. But if the thing doesn't work, then it doesn't work. So maybe they convince themselves that, since they have all these really smart people that they could put on the project, since they have all this money that they can attract from, they could probably twist arms to people to say, like, put in 100 million, put in 50 million, that with all those things that they could put together, and their control of the media and their power in the corridors of deep state, that I think that they probably convinced themselves that they could pull it off. But
I think that's a really popular philosophy, especially in tech startups. Fake it till you make it. We have this idea, we think we can pull it off, so we're just gonna fake it until we get there, and that's how you got it. That's how you raise the money. That's how you fund it, is by convincing people that you can do it, so that they fund you, and then you eventually can get there. But I mean, in this case, like you said earlier, this was clearly not going to happen.
And then you add to that the hubris of the people on the board and the investors.
Yeah, hubris. I think the hubris was exactly it. It was yet another of the many, many stories of Icarus flying too close to the sun, and the wax melted and the thing crashed to the ground. I think that, she was able to get funding from Don Lucas Sr. and from Tim Draper. And these two people were, they're not household names, but they are two of the most prominent Silicon Valley venture capital investors. However, one thing I found out since I published my articles is that, based on my experience, I know that when you go to large investors, large institutional investors, that they tend to specialize in certain industries. Sorry, not institutional investors. I mean like hedge funds, private equity funds, venture capital funds. They tend to specialize in certain types of investments, right? So if they specialize in biotech or in healthcare technologies, they will have either on retainer or outsourced staff, specialists, experts for these types of technologies. And so if Elizabeth Holmes came to pitch her project to such people, she would be eliminated straight away. They should immediately be able to see that this is a fraud. She was not ever transparent about the technology. Investing, like the way she presented Theranos is like, you invest on our say-so. You don't ask about the technology. We do not disclose the technology. That's our own in-house secret. And if you don't like it, then you invest somewhere else. That was like their kind of arrogant approach towards investors. But one thing I learned since I published my article is that when she did go pitch to these types of venture capital funds that did perform due diligence, every single time she was turned away in the first round, okay? Which means that people were able to see immediately that there's something wrong with this story. So, it should have been possible for George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, Mad Dog Mattis, Gary Roughhead, Sam Nunn, all of these characters to get the same information. And even, one of these people tried on 2 occasions to get Dr. Phyllis Gardner from Stanford, the Stanford Medical School, to kind of join Theranos, to give kind of her backing to Elizabeth Holmes. And on both occasions, Dr. Phyllis Gardner very quickly established that this girl had no idea what she was talking about, and that the supposed technology she said she had invented was absolutely impossible. So she refused to have anything to do with her. So yeah, it was a scam from much higher up than where Elizabeth Holmes is. And the fact that the media goes on with this story about how this one young woman was able to fool all these investors and all these very extremely powerful people is just a silly way to interpret it.
Right, because these investors and board members, for the most part, knew that what they were peddling was a fraud. They, for example, George Shultz, his grandson, Tyler Shultz, approached him about this and was rebuffed, essentially. And the project continued. It wasn't like they weren't aware that their proposed technology was
There were many attempted
false
whistleblowers. Many attempted whistleblowers,
right,
like low-level people, employees, and things like that. And each and every time they were shot down.
Yeah, that's right. There was a very aggressive culture of intimidation against employees who raised concerns about the technology, about the fact that they were lying to patients, that they were lying to their partners, like Walgreens, like Pfizer, like various hospital centers and health centers that were starting to use the technology. And in each case, the merits of the concern were not addressed. Rather, the person was made to sign non-disclosure. They were intimidated. And Jesse, what you mentioned is absolutely an important giveaway, that when when Tyler Schultz, George Schultz's grandson, and one of the lab technicians, Erica Chung, went straight to George Schultz to tell him that the technology didn't work, that the company was lying to the customers, that the sales and profit figures were all fake, that that there's all kinds of problem with the company. If George Schultz were fooled into accepting a seat at the board of directors, he would have done a minimal investigation of these claims, and then he would have instantly distanced himself from Theranos, resigned from the board of directors, and said, sorry, they fooled me. I have nothing to do with this story anymore. Whereas instead, he got the David Boyce companies, Boyce Schiller, the very powerful Democratic lawyers, to start pursuing all the potential whistleblower, and apparently they were very extremely nasty and aggressive about it, particularly towards Tyler Schultz. And so that tells you that from that point on, a full-on cover-up started.
Right. And John Kariaou, I believe it's pronounced, who may still be a journalist with the Wall Street Journal. He was the first to break the story of this fraud. And he says himself, having been subject to surveillance, harassment, intimidation, that it was unlike anything he had ever experienced in his, at that time, 20 years of reporting.
Yeah.
They interviewed
that's right.
several employees in the documentary, and the employees were saying they were being keystroked. They would send out emails that didn't CC Elizabeth Holmes or her partner, whom I'm forgetting his name. But they would get emails back from Elizabeth Holmes or the partner.
Ramesh Balwani.
Yes. And so all of their emails were being watched. They were being essentially siloed, where they weren't there was no conversation allowed between employees. You had to sign non-disclosure agreements. It was a very cloak and dagger operation. And employees were talking about they've never experienced anything like that.
Yeah, that's right. And that's all correct, but the thing that I find particularly encouraging about the whole story is that all the same, it unraveled and fell apart, and it did so in a very spectacular way. And so that, to me, the thing that makes story worth telling is not that there are fraudsters on Silicon Valley, that there are devious, deceptive schemes being run from very high levels of power, but the fact that they failed because they did put $750 million into this thing. They did run it from 2003 until 2016, so for more than 13 years they tried their best to make it happen. They did have very important agenda in mind with this type of technology. They had control over the media. They had strong public relations support. They had extremely powerful people on the board of directors. I think that until September of 2015, this thing looked unstoppable. And then just because there was a small handful of individuals who knew that the thing was a fraud and that everything was based on a lie, and who wouldn't keep silent, the whole thing fell apart. And I think that's the most beautiful thing about it.
Right.
Yes.
And this is something you highlight at the end of your investigative piece on this, which we'll link to.
I'm going to throw that in the chat for everybody right now. It's a 3-part piece. I'm going to link to part 1, and then you can find links to part 2, part 3 as you go through.
Right. In part 3, you have these 6 lessons, which you're alluding to.
Do you want me to pull that up, Jesse?
Right now. Sure. And before we get any further into those, I want to get your take on the fact that even though Theranos failed, it did lay the groundwork in a sense for what we're going through now with this so-called pandemic. And there are people such as Bill Gates who are attempting in a way to pick up where Theranos left off. And you talk about this in your piece, the short video that Bill Gates put out at the beginning of 2021, talking about um, mass testing to sort of preempt pandemics and mass testing to an extent where you'd be able to do 20% of the population in a week. So it seems that even though Theranos has failed spectacularly, as you say in your piece, it hasn't dissuaded uh, new players from coming along and trying to pick up the broken pieces and make it into some sort of new uh, way to democratize diagnostics, as Theranos originally put it.
I think that's a good point. I think that there's this isn't about, really, it's not about Theranos. It's about the underlying agenda. And there's always going to be
Exactly.
another player who's coming along willing to pick up where it left off, because it's not it is just an underlying agenda. So it's just who's going to
Yeah.
be the front person for it now. And if they failed this time, they've learned some lessons. And moving forward, they'll figure out how to make those things work differently and more in their favor. And that's really where the struggle is trying to keep, one step ahead of them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's why understanding the Theranos story is important. And also the fact that by Theranos failing, the agenda didn't stop, because we have seen that the Silicon Valley investors have continued funding another several different companies who basically wanted to pick up where Theranos left off. And some of them are essentially pursuing the exact same vision. We've seen that over last summer, George Soros funds, I don't know exactly what legal entity, but linked to George Soros, and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations purchased a British company called Mologic, which is also supposed, the intent is to provide quick, inexpensive COVID tests for, large numbers of people. And then we also learned just a few days ago that Joe Biden administration just allocated some $134 million, I think, something in that ballpark figure, for a German company to build a factory in the United States to create fast COVID tests. The thing that kind of gets your attention is that this factory will not even begin producing these tests until, at the earliest, end of 2024, which tells you that these people have no intention of dismounting this thing that they started. So they will be bugging us with these tests and vaccines and sanitary passes and whatever they invent until
until they can't anymore. I mean, to
until
me,
they
this is
can.
this is the new forever war. They had the war on drugs, they had the war on terror, and now they have the war on pandemics. So it's just another money-making machine that's meant to be forever, and it's meant to make as much profit as humanly possible. And this is just another iteration of that.
Yeah, but I think it's meant to do a lot more than make a lot of money. I think it's made to get us used to living with these conditional liberty passes that expire, and that we can have our lives back only provided that we comply with all the rules that they set at their discretion. So today it's the vaccines, but tomorrow it might be something else. And as you use these passes to go see movies or baseball games today, tomorrow it might be linked to your internet access, to your utilities, to your bank account. And if you're not compliant, they can just, block your, they can block your money, your bank account. They could block your internet access. They can block your electricity, water, whatever. They can really get very tyrannical with this type of thing. And I think that once they have initiated this plot, this agenda, they cannot retreat. They cannot say like, okay, it didn't work out really, so let's forget it. We'll try it again. But I think that this is also the reason why it is absolutely imperative for us to insist on accountability, because the reason why these parasite classes are able to concoct all these harebrained schemes and fail, that these things fail very often. The reason why they can concoct them is because, like whatever they do, they get off scot-free, they regroup and they try again. And I think that they should be, there absolutely should be some form of a Nuremberg II tribunals. I'm not in favor of death penalty, but I think that they should exactly be given the treatment that they intended for us. They should be made to own nothing and be happy. And if they like to be vaccinated once every quarter, then vaccinate them once every quarter. And then if you confiscated the assets from Bill Gates, George Soros, all these banking families and so forth, you could probably distribute this to the people whose businesses they've destroyed and whose livelihoods they've absolutely devastated. And I think in the West, the how do you call it, the idea, the very idea of redistribution of wealth has become untouchable. You cannot even go there. You're immediately proscribed as some kind of a commie, a terrorist or something. But in actual fact, this is routinely done. This is you have in the United States civil forfeiture, and I've seen a video of Jesus. The name of your president.
Biden.
Joe Biden. Oh my God, it's a complete blank out. I've seen a video.
I wish I could forget too, Alex. Don't worry.
I've seen a video of Joe. I was going to say, what's the guy? Let's go, Brandon. I've seen a video of him giving a speech in the House of Representatives where he was advocating in favor of complete civil forfeiture of these how do you call them, these sexual predators people, So it shouldn't be an alien idea, like when you've plotted to commit the greatest crime against humanity ever planned, ever contrived, ever executed, then I'm sorry, but you lose everything. You lose all your chips.
Right. Yes. And that's in essence what we're talking about right now is the greatest crime against humanity that's ever been perpetrated. And it's happening not at a nation state level. It's happening at a supranational level.
That's right.
And you mentioned this control of our finances digitally, for example, and it's not conspiracy. This is fact on paper where the central banking class wants to go. They want to move us to central bank digital currencies. They want to do away with sovereign currencies, and they want to use that to wield centralized control over all, and if not all, as much of the world's population as they can. And I think what we're seeing with these so-called vaccines is an attempt at depopulation, because the world's population as it stands is too much for them to control at once. And all of these things come together Theranos fitting in, I think, as being an early run or a template for what we're experiencing now.
Yes,
Yeah,
definitely.
I absolutely agree. I think that this is a conclusion that, you know, is very difficult to avoid. I know that many people don't like to even think that somebody could be that evil, but these people obviously are. Obviously,
Yes.
they don't lose any sleep about what there's like more than how many people are not dead on the VAERS database? More than 20,000 people, right?
I mean,
Yeah.
football players are
Well,
dropping dead. It seems like once a
yeah,
day, or you know what I mean? It's insane what's happening right now.
yeah, yeah, and you know, like I also wondered, you know, we know about the athletes dropping dead because we see it on camera, but what's happening to people who are not on camera? You know,
Right.
like how many how many of these collapses occur where nobody sees it, or in you know, like in people's private home? Well, you know, now we have a better idea since this I forget the name, but there was a life insurance the CEO of a life insurance company in the United States last, I think it was just last week or 2 weeks ago, who said that they've seen a 40% increase in mortality of all causes among the adult population for all age groups. And a 40% increase in mortality is so spectacularly high, it's pretty much never happened. He said in his statement that a 10% increase in mortality would be a three sigma event, something that happens once in 200 years. And we are experiencing 4 times that. So this is that effect of of everybody dropping dead, not just the ones we see on cameras.
Yes.
Right.
And so
And VAERS is notoriously uh,
underreported, right?
underreported, right? It's a passive reporting system, so it relies on people and also on healthcare providers to fill out the reports themselves. But the math on it is something in the range of 1 to 10% of
Yeah.
adverse events are reported. So,
Yeah, and I understand that if you want your adverse effect or injury to be included in the VAERS database, that you kind of have to be really determined about it. That it's not just sign this form and submit it and off you go. That you have to kind of really insist and push it forward.
right. And to sort of bolster what I said about this being a crime with the aim of one of its aims being depopulation, there was an analysis that was just done by Dr. Michael Yeadon, along with several other doctors and scientists, I believe. And they analyzed VAERS data, um, and they went through adverse events by the Pfizer injection, the Moderna injection, and the Janssen or Johnson and Johnson injection, and they went by batch number, and they produced a graph that showed the adverse events per batch number and how uneven it was. And Michael Yeadon said that it's impossible for the adverse events to vary this much among different batches, unless somebody is doing this, somebody or somebodies are doing this on purpose and
Well, that's a huge part of it.
purposely varying what's in the batches. And that's why we're seeing one of the reasons why we're seeing uh, some people get permanently disabled or die, and other people, at least for the time being, have no adverse reactions to these
Yeah,
injections.
yeah, yeah,
So, more and more evidence is emerging that this is being done on purpose. And there are people at these companies, these big pharma companies, who know about this. They are consistently going into VAERS to look at the data themselves. They know the batch numbers. They know just about each and every person who's been injected with which batch. So there is willful, on purpose orchestration of what's going on. This isn't just me hypothesizing that it's about depopulation. The evidence is there. It's very clear.
Yes.
Yeah. And yeah, go ahead, Misty. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I think that a big part of that is the fact that, and obviously I'm going to talk about this because this is what I do, but the fact that they're able to control the information systems, they're able to control the dialogue, they're able to control the discourse, they're able to censor people who are bringing forth the information that Jesse is talking about. That's a huge part of how they're able to get away with this, is that they're able to manipulate, basically manufacture the reality for people. They use fear as a manipulator. Fear is a very powerful manipulator. And then they're able to control all of the discourse and shut down any dissent. And that leaves people extremely misinformed, uninformed, and scared. And that's a really dangerous combination.
Yeah, fully agreed. But this is exactly where then the story of Theranos is the extremely relevant petri dish of this larger agenda, because you had exactly the same kind of interplay of factors with Theranos, that you had this information blockade, you had this culture of fear, you had this control over the media, you had this very, very mean, nasty, aggressive intimidation of would-be whistleblowers. You had extremely powerful people running the show and directing the agenda towards the objectives that were clear to them. You also had most of the employees at Theranos who thought like, I'll just, get a good line on my CV, I'll collect some money, and I'll play dead, so I can move on to something better in the future. So they were not exactly willing to rock the boat. But there was a small handful who could not tolerate that. So I think that even today, as you look at this pandemic agenda unfolding, they obviously have no intention to stop with this. They obviously intend to run this show for as long as they can get away with it. They're obviously exercising very heavy-handed censorship and control over what can come out in the media. They do not hesitate to decry and censor people like Robert Malone, who invented the technology in the first place. People like Michael Eden, people like I don't know. I've seen hundreds of very extremely qualified.
It's a very long list.
A very long list of virologists, epidemiologists, infectologists who are not on board with this agenda, who disagree, who have different things to say. They are being systematically eliminated from the debate. But all the same, when the whole, there one element that is not obvious about Theranos and about this whole idea of pushing through fraudulent schemes is that, if you wanted to have people like Nobel laureates, like Luc Montagnier, like Michael Eden, like Dr. McCullough, this caliber of person to face the public and lie into the camera and lie to journalists and so forth, they just won't do that. Your highest caliber expert will not sell out. They will not blacken their name by participating in something that's devious and fraudulent like this. So then to realize this kind of a scheme, you always have to rely on people who are a lesser quality of leadership material, right? You have to go with people who are willing to lie, people who are willing to sell out their integrity, people who will do whatever needs to be done for money and for fame or for ambitions or whatever. People like Elizabeth Holmes. Well, you could study how things happen in Theranos and see what this type of leadership gets you. It gets you political infighting, it gets you extremely low morale within the, and you depend on very large number of people to be pushing this, right? Because it goes maybe from the banking cartel, then World Health Organization, then people like George Soros and Bill Gates and Anthony Fauci and so on. But then there's the whole hierarchy of literally tens of thousands of people who are meant to, persuade people to take the vaccine, persuade people to stay in a lockdown, persuade neighbors to report on neighbors, persuade the police to be extra vigilant and zealous.
Policy enforcers.
Policy enforcers. There's like literally tens of thousands of people who would have to be executing flawlessly for like a sustained period of time for them to get to where they want to go. And like when you have this low quality leadership, when you have these people like Walensky, like Anthony Fauci, like all these characters that you have in various different governments,
Peter
Justin,
Hotez.
yeah, just like Justin Trudeau in like these people generally can't stand these people.
Yeah.
And like imagine taking orders from them, orders that make no sense to you, and saying, you know what, this doesn't make any sense for me to do, but because Anthony Fauci says it, I'm going to do it, and I'm going to put my name behind it. This starts to crumble, because people say like, I can't do this anymore. So people start resigning. People start resigning from the media. People start doing their jobs in a lackadaisical way, where they should be zealous and consequential and do things right. They kind of lose their mojo, and the whole thing slowly starts to unravel. And so go back to Theranos. This whole thing already started well before Theranos, but well before the John Carreiro story was published in the Wall Street Journal. It already started to crumble from inside. But at the time when John Carreiro's story appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Theranos was practically in the zenith. And for outside observers, it may have looked like a shining castle. It may have looked unstoppable. Elizabeth Holmes may have looked like a wonderful genius, celebrity person, inventor that everybody would not hesitate to follow and use her technology and so forth. But the thing was already lost. And I think that that's where we are today. Outwardly, it may seem like this thing still has momentum, like it's still happening. But I think that there are too many people who are no longer going along with it. I think that the leadership is turning into a wet noodle, and that the whole thing will inevitably collapse.
Oh, I hope you're right.
No, I'd be willing to bet money that I'm right, but I think that I think that people in charge are aware of this. I think that they know that this is not going to be what they hoped it would be. And I think that they're going to have to switch query. I think that they're going to have to try to redirect our grievances to hate on the Russians, to hate on the Chinese, or whoever they decide is going to be their next forever war.
Or switch the emergency to climate change, for example, or a cyber pandemic.
Yeah, I agree, but it seems to me that they have exhausted their credibility, and I think that people are starting to intuit that the climate change is the same class of invisible enemy like this virus, pushed by the same people, and that it's the same deception. So I don't think that switching it to climate change will reinvigorate the the population's willingness to go along and drink the Kool-Aid. I think that you would have to try to generate some kind of a hatred towards. Well, I think by now it's pretty much down to the Chinese and the Russians.
I think you're right, though. I think it needs to be like a tangible enemy, because climate change is something kind of abstract, so people can't really see it. So if it's something tangible, something that people can actually like, oh yes, that's my enemy, and they can see it and they can hear it, and I think that that's a different level.
Yeah, and like I've experienced the breakout of war in the former Yugoslavia, and like something very impressive happens when the war begins, and that is that almost instantly the psychology changes, in the sense that before you take Pearl Harbor as an example. Before that event, you might have nuanced discussion about other sides' security concerns, about like you might say, like, well, the Russians have a point about this and that, but once there's that catalyzing event, something gets people's attention that like mesmerizes everybody and has a very strong emotional impact. From that point on, even if you hate Joe Biden, even if you completely disagree with your country's leadership, people tend to very rapidly close ranks behind their leaders. And from that point on, the business of war becomes the nation's core central preoccupation. And then you don't ask any more questions. And from that point on, the political establishment doesn't hesitate to deal with the dissenters, with the oppositions in a very heavy-handed way. You've seen during the World War II that after Pearl Harbor, people didn't object to their Japanese neighbors being taken to detention camps, and people like Joe Rogan, people like Tucker Carlson, people like yourselves would be probably shut down very quickly, and so things turn black and white very quickly. So my fear, having lived through this actually taking place, is that they will try to morph this failing pandemic agenda into a World War III agenda.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm often reminded, with regard to war, of World War I and the way that was, in a sense, orchestrated for global finance at that time, even in the early 20th century. That was largely to do with resetting, to use the verbiage of today, the world financial system. And that was, I don't think it needs to be said, horrific, took a horrific toll on humanity, and shows to what lengths people in power, not just on the nation state level, but as we said earlier, on a supranational level, to what lengths they're willing to go to achieve the ends they have in mind, which is virtually destroying humanity.
Yeah, that is correct, and I think that they have absolutely no scruple about doing that. In fact, it kind of works well with their idea of depopulation. Because they would certainly, like with the amount of discontent pretty much everywhere in the developed world, I think that they'd rather be surrounded by trees than by hordes of disenfranchised, hungry humans who might like to help themselves to their belongings.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So I very much want to share your optimism. What frightens me, though, is the scale of what's happening compared to the scale of what happened with Theranos. So Theranos was more of an American empire level, and as we've been saying, what we're experiencing now is at a supranational level. It's beyond the nation state level. So there's the scale of coordination is much bigger, and that's what frightens me about being about it stopping, at least anytime soon, is that it's such a leviathan when you put it up against what Theranos was trying to achieve. I don't know if you agree or disagree with that, but I do think that we
are seeing a lot of pushback, though. I mean, the
right,
protests
we
are
have to be
massive.
we right, there are signs and legitimate reasons to be very cautiously optimistic, I think. But
Yeah, and I think that the fact that this is much bigger than Theranos was also makes it a lot more fragile, because there's a lot more moving parts to the whole thing. There are many more sources of pushback and discontent, and I think that there are many more whistleblowers. And if you look at, the Silicon Valley tech giants are trying their best to censor and silence the dissenters, but it's that kind of works if your dissenter is 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 100, and then you can identify them and pick them off. But when there's this like a rising tide, like a tsunami of everybody, because there are tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who are doing their research, who are speaking out. Maybe they're not speaking to a huge audience like Jimmy Dore or Joe Rogan, but maybe they're speaking to a few dozen of their followers on Twitter or on Facebook, and that's enough for the information to diffuse unstoppably beyond their control, because they cannot, like once upon a time when you depended on television and radio and newspapers, then it all went from the same center. They could control the editorial policy, and there was no chance of something really going out to a large mass of people that you don't control. Well, now that's just simply impossible. So I think that we're in a better shape. I think that where we have to be careful is that we stand our ground, we persevere in pushing back and saying no, but also that we observe the events abroad, like Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Syria, China, Taiwan, all of these things very critically.
Yes.
They are outright lying, like I sometimes get asked about, like, oh my God, did you know that the Chinese have done this and that? And I said, like, well, I don't know. How did you find out? I said, like, oh, well, it was on BBC.
yeah.
And I said, like, well, why would you believe what the BBC is reporting? But they were showing videos of these prisoners being marched by police. And I said, like, well, how do you know where that was filmed or who that was or what that was? Like, they have outright lied. Like they would like invent stories.
The white helmets is a great example of that.
Right. We saw this.
White helmets,
we saw this with Duma, which
yes,
the staged chemical attacks in Duma in Syria, which coincidentally or maybe not, Mattis was the Secretary of Defense who was behind the airstrikes on Syria that resulted from this staged attack on Duma. So
I mean, the white helmets have they have like a film, it's literally like a production. It's a production.
Yeah, exactly.
It's,
exactly.
and action. It's the whole thing.
That's right. And the whole purpose of that production, and it was set up by a former British intelligence officer, the whole purpose of that production is to deceive the Western public.
Yes.
And you might remember that when North Korea was one of the prime targets for regime change, that they had reports about Kim Jong-un executing his uncle, who was a military general, by throwing him to the dogs, and then they executed somebody else by using the anti-aircraft guns, and then like he was executing his ex-girlfriend when he was done with them. And then years later, it turned out that all these people that were supposed to be eaten by dogs and torn to pieces by anti-aircraft and the girlfriends, they all resurfaced still alive. So their main method of generating consent for war is demonizing their target regimes. So I think that we have to be particularly careful to believe reports from China, reports from Russia, reports from Ukraine, where they always want to tell you, like, oh my God, like Russia is invading Ukraine. We have to do something. Really? Russia is probably not invading Ukraine. And why would you have to do something about that isn't that Ukraine's problem rather than NATO's, British, American, German problem, and so forth?
Right.
Yes.
When this latest round of hostility, to put it mildly, between Ukraine and Russia, although I would say it's more so NATO led by the US and Russia, when that kicked off and initial reports were coming out, particularly in UK media, there were Ukrainians who were saying, we have no idea what you're talking about. We're not seeing anything on the ground here about Russia
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
ramping up for an invasion of any kind. But the media built it, and now look where we are today. The brinksmanship has gotten to the point where there very well could be something that kicks off because the media fomented it to such a point that that's where
Yeah.
it's at now. And you know, just to wrap up here, one of the things I want to say, and this ties into the Theranos saga and particularly the trial, is that the victims in all of this are always ordinary people like us. And if we look at the Theranos trial, none of the charges for which Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty related to defrauding or harming patients in any way, even though there were charges brought to seek some sort of recompense for the patients. So we've got to remember that it's the ordinary people who are always going to suffer the most from this.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think that there's some kind of a perverse indifference towards the suffering of the people. And one of the stories that I cannot understand is the story related to Andrew Cuomo, you know, the governor. His actions directly resulted in the death of tens of thousands of senior care homes, right? And everybody kind of thinks like, whatever. But you know, the fact that he was coming on to some girls and maybe being a little bit pushy and aggressive, that gets everybody outraged. So I don't quite understand that. And so I think with the same with Theranos, you know, like it seems that you know, that she defrauded investors, that she was conducting wire fraud and so forth. That's big deal. The fact that many people suffered because they got wrong diagnosis, that maybe took wrong treatment, that may, you know, like many of these cases may have resulted in harm or death, doesn't matter. That, like, nobody cares. I don't quite understand that, but that's where we are, and somehow this whole system seems to have to a large extent perverted what makes us human, you know, basically the ordinary instincts of humanity, where the life and well-being of your next of kin, or your neighbor, or your clansman, or your, you know, your compatriot should matter, but for some reason they don't.
Yes, we've been kind of forced into this individualistic mentality where as long as I'm okay and I'm fine, then nobody else matters. And it's really sad to see. And they, you know, the further they isolate us through lockdowns and stuff like that, the worse that will get. So I think that's something that people really need to keep in mind. Thanks for coming on, though. I know that you're dealing with limited battery time. So I'm going to drop the link once again in the chat for everybody to the 3-part piece that Alex wrote on the Theranos saga, I guess is really the best way to put it. It's a really awesome, there's also a video included in part 1. What is it, like 45 minutes or something like that?
I think it's just about just south of 45 minutes, but you know, for people who prefer to listen to it or watch, it's the video covers all 3 parts, whereas the article is broken into 3 parts because it's kind of longish.
Yes. But
Yeah.
all are worthwhile if you're more interested in videos or listening, which sometimes that's easier for me as I'm doing chores or whatever. It's easier to just listen
Yeah,
to something.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that you put that in there because I love, like, there's not always times where I can sit down and read an article. I sometimes have to listen to things. So yeah, you guys should definitely check that out. Do you have anything else you want to tell everybody where they can find you and find your work?
I'm on Twitter. It's @nakedhedgy, right? I have also a professional website called iSystem Trend Following, because as I mentioned in the beginning, I'm not a journalist. So I'm I'm a former hedge fund manager, and today I provide daily market reports for subscribers. One month is always free of charge for people to check it out if that suits them for their investment requirements. And that's on my website, iSystem Trend Following.
And
Excellent.
you've also written 3 books that have all been banned to some extent, correct?
No, to be precise, one of them has been properly banned.
Okay.
The book was called The Grand Deception because it was a book about these relations between Russia and the West. And but the other 2 books, that's a different story. But basically, Amazon forgot to pay me royalties for the longest time, since December 2018. And then this year, it kind of added up. And so I thought, like, well, maybe you guys might want to pay me at some point. What's going on with that? And after about 3 months of back and forth, some human being from Amazon responded and said, like, yeah, actually, it looks like we owe you some money. We're gonna send you a wire transfer within the next 5 to 8 business days. And then literally 3 hours after that, I received an email from another somebody at Amazon who said that they suspect that I was manipulating their terms of services, that they would be terminating my account, deleting everything, the records, the books, the reviews, and that they would not be paying me out anything. So that's what they did. I think that wasn't the question of banning it, because my other 2 books were just basically business titles, right? But I think that somewhere in the plumbing of the system, they must have an incentive to just rob the counterparty, because maybe it's better to take a few $1,000 from me than to pay them out to me.
Yeah.
And so that's what happened. And now I might add that one of my books got an award for the best book on commodities trading for investors and traders. And the books are all available as free downloads on my site, because I saw that Amazon, after they deleted my account, they continued selling my books,
Ugh.
but they upped the price from $25 to $900. I thought, no, you don't. No, you don't. And so I put my books, for the time being, they're free downloads, and so anybody can help themselves.
To $900.
That's amazing.
Yeah, something like that. I don't know if it was $899.95 or something like that. I forget the number, but it was a very, very high number. And
That's incredible.
So they made them collector's items in a sense.
Essentially, yeah.
Just piracy. Yeah, like the author was canceled. So now the book is kind of expensive.
Oh,
Wow.
that's funny. They're going to cancel you and then reap the benefits of such cancellation. That's amazing.
Exactly.
Leave it to
No,
Amazon.
Those space flights, those space flights cost money. It's nothing personal.
The penis rockets cost money, you guys. Somebody's got to pay for it. Anyways, thanks for coming on. We really appreciate your
It's
time.
my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Greetings to your viewers, and it was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Yes,
Absolutely.
of course. Thank you for your coverage. Again, like I said at the beginning, it is different than most other coverage of the Holmes trial and the Theranos thing. So we appreciate that. And thanks for coming on. Thanks to everybody who's been hanging out with us. We appreciate you as well. And we will see you soon. Bye, guys.